The United States' astronomical defense budgets are casually thrown around in a lot of political conversations today. But what is all that money being spent on, especially when we're actually at war? We decided to investigate the most expensive war in history, World War II, which cost over $4 trillion, to discover just what the US spent all that cash on. Back when Hitler was raging throughout Europe and Japan was attacking Pearl Harbor, the US decided it needed to help the Allies stop the Axis powers from taking over. To do so, it spent around $4.1 trillion over the span of 3 years and almost 9 months. In those days, the actual sum was just $341.5 billion. But in those days, people also paid $35 a month in rent, so the $4 trillion is adjusted for today's inflation. At the peak of the war, in its final year, 1945, the defense budget of the U.S. rose to 37.5% of total GDP. For comparison, in 2020, the U.S. defense budget was around 3.7% of GDP, which is kind of the same as long as you ignore that decimal point that has shifted one giant step to the left. As you can see, a huge chunk of the economy at the time was oriented toward the war. In fact, the US spent much more than any other country involved in the war ever did. Some historians believe this exorbitant spending might have helped them win. To get an idea of how high the US defense spending of $341.5 billion was, the next highest spending country was Germany, which spent a total of $270 billion, even though they spent more years fighting in the actual war. The Soviet Union came out to $192 billion, while Japan spent $56 billion total. So, what did the US spend all this money on? Well, the first order of business was paying the over 16 million servicemen and women who were fighting the war on 3 different continents. The average private serving in World War II made around $50 a month, or around $680 adjusted for today's inflation. Though it might seem like a ridiculously low amount, even for the 40s, Army men actually took home more than those making the average U.S. salary, even though income per capita in 1945 came out to $1,223 per year. Though this might seem illogical at first, when taking into account that the men's food, shelter, clothes, and many other necessities were provided by the Army, Barron's magazine estimated that the average single military man's pay scaled out to the civilian equivalent of $3,600. This pay was further boosted by the fact that any military man making less than $1,500 a year, which was the vast majority of enlisted officers, would not have their income subjected to income tax. Of course, the U.S. was aware that financial incentives such as these might encourage more citizens to enter the war, which is why they passed the Pay Readjustment Act of 1942 a few months after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. The previous salary for an Army private was $21 a month, so the Pay Readjustment Act resulted in more than doubling of the armed forces' salaries. Moving up the ranks, pay understandably increased even more. Generals at the time made $666.67 a month, which gave them an annual salary of around $8,000. This means that out of the World War II defense budget, tens of billions were paid out to servicemen and women laying down their lives for years at the front. If we estimate that each soldier was getting a private salary for 3.75 years, that comes out to around $36 billion. However, obviously, there were plenty of people getting higher salaries, not to mention that the Army was also providing the soldiers with billions and billions of dollars in food, shelter, clothing, and other supplies. This was in addition to transporting them to 3 different continents around the world. Though no exact numbers exist for how much the deployment of all those soldiers cost, it's fair to assume that of the $341.5 billion spent at the time, subtracting the amount spent on equipment, the $158.5 billion left over was mostly spent on training, transporting, feeding, sheltering, clothing, paying, and otherwise supplying personnel. A small percentage of that was also spent on military and government administration costs, since anyone who's come within 5 feet of the military knows the mountain of bureaucracy that must be waded through requires its own economy to function. But as enjoyable as administrative paperwork sounds, let's focus on the military's equipment instead. U.S. aircraft production was the largest part of the war economy. A total of $183 billion was spent on war production, and almost 25% of that, or $45 billion, was spent on airplanes. The money went toward producing over 300,000 planes between 1941 and 1945, including 49,123 bombers, 63,933 fighters, and 14,710 cargo planes, while paying over 2 million workers on the front lines of the production process. The powers at war knew that whichever side ruled the skies would have a massive strategic advantage. Some of the money was spent not only on production but on technological development too. It wasn't enough to have more planes in the sky, it was important for the US and Allied planes to have the most sophisticated equipment possible as well. Heavy bombers like the B-29 Superfortress were developed thanks to unprecedented cooperation between the Air Force, private contractors, and labor unions. The B-29 project cost $3 billion and resulted in giant technological leaps in radar systems, bomb sights, high-performance high-performance engines, and metallurgy, to name a few. Next, between $13 and $18 billion were spent on the construction of 5,777 ships by the U.S. Maritime Commission during World War II. The federal government directed the shipbuilding and funded entrepreneurs experienced with mass production methods to transfer these technologies over to shipbuilding for quicker production. World War II shipbuilding included the production of 10 battleships, 27 aircraft carriers, and 907 cruisers and destroyers. Additionally, over 211 submarines were built during this time. We've traveled by air, flown by sea. Time to check in on what was being produced for fighting on land, which is where most of the rest of the $183 billion production budget was spent. Over 100,000 tanks and armored vehicles were produced by the U.S. between 1939 and 1945, as well as 41,000 guns and howitzers. Additionally, 12.5 million rifles and carbines, as well as 41 billion rounds of ammunition, were produced in factories. At this point, it's important to point out that not all of these weapons and supplies ended up being used by U.S. forces. In fact, many were produced before the U.S. even entered the war and then used to supply the Allies in Europe. Additionally, we have to bring up the darkest chapter of the war, the Manhattan Project. The research that developed and created the atomic bomb was funded with $2 billion at the time, or approximately $29 billion in 2021. For those wondering how a small team of scientists in a lab could have spent that much, we have some surprising news. The Manhattan Project employed over 100,000 people. They used a whole system of laboratories and plants throughout the country, including labs at the University of Chicago and Berkeley, multiple uranium processing complexes, and the famous weapon design lab at Los Alamos, New Mexico. At this point, you might be thinking, how is all this funded? How is it that you've been driving over the same pothole down the street for 10 years and you can't get your city to spend money to send people to fix it? But in World War II, factories everywhere were repurposed and billions of dollars were handed over to fund the most gargantuan war effort in recent history. Well, the war was financed through a couple of different methods, most of which, honestly, probably wouldn't work in the modern-day US. First, it's important to point out that the military took over the war effort pretty quickly and was able to redirect a staggering amount of consumer production toward military production without civilian groups having much power to stand in the way. The government created a whole wide range of mobilization agencies, which directed the manufacture of necessary military goods and then purchased them for the armed forces. Though most European wartime manufacturing was directed by councils composed of both civilians and military officials, the Army and Navy had almost unfettered control over the provision of both equipment and personnel for World War II. In many places throughout the U.S., production all but ceased on items like cars, non-military clothing, and non-essential foods. This explains how production was reoriented toward a wartime economy, but not how it was paid for. Well, because this was way before the time when the US could just keep shooting its debt up to see what happens, most of the money spent on World War II was funded by war bonds and an increase in income taxes. How much of an increase, you might ask? Trigger warnings for fiscal conservatives. The income tax rate for the wealthy in 1945, defined as those who made over $200,000, around $3 million in modern day, a year maxed out at 94%. You heard that right. That being said, the income tax rate was already between 66 and 79% in 1939 to begin with, so the increase wasn't as crazy as it sounds to our 21st century ears. For comparison, the 2021 top marginal income tax rate was 37%, even though, let's be honest, not a single rich person actually paid that. Tax rates for those in the lowest bracket, which included those making as little as $500 a year, also jumped from 4% to 23% between 1939 and 1945. In fact, the total number of U.S. citizens required to pay taxes jumped from 7.6 million in 1939 to 49.9 million in 1945. It's fair to say everyone was chipping in, whether they wanted to or not. However, the vast majority of World War II funding, 63% to be exact, was covered by war bonds. President Roosevelt purchased the first one on May 1, 1941 to set an example for the country. Celebrities endorsed them and widespread marketing campaigns urged citizens to buy them. They were not so subtle. Everyone watching this has probably heard of war bonds, but how do they actually work? Well, they were sold as a stable source of investment for many citizens. People would buy the bonds at 75% of face value. The bonds would return a 2.9% annual interest after a period of 10 years, to be essentially redeemed for the actual value they represented. Since consumer prices also rose during that time, many civilians didn't necessarily get a good return on their investment, but they wanted to contribute to the war effort anyway. Plus, if they kept the bonds for a period of 30 to 40 years, they might end up making a small profit around 4%, since bonds were granted an interest extension for up to 30 or 40 years. Bonds were available in denominations of 25, 50, 100, 500, and 1,000, with a couple of higher value denominations added later on for the wealthier civilians. Even children could spend the few cents they had on war stamps, which functioned similarly to bonds. By the time the war ended, 85 million people had purchased $185.7 billion worth of U.S. bonds. This comes out to approximately $2,185 in war bonds per person. Though obviously that's an average, and not reflective of the actual amount an average U.S. citizen spent, since wealthier investors could have skewed the curve. It's still incredibly impressive at a time when the average household, not individual, brought in $2,595 a year. World War II was a time of inconceivable suffering and violence for many countries. Some of the biggest atrocities in recent history were committed during the conflict. If perhaps one silver lining can be gleaned from this video investigating how the US spent over $4 trillion on a war, it's that the whole country managed to organize itself and band together to help stop a genocide and deadly aggressors abroad. Now that you discovered how the US spent so much money on the most expensive war in history, why not check out some of our other cool videos about past wars? Or perhaps click on one of our many non-war related videos instead.